everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mario Lucero, Associate Director of the UIC Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, or better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us today for our Climates of Inequality online conversation series with local environmental and climate justice leaders. So let's just do a quick access check. Is your audio okay? Give me a thumbs up, your little icon. Can y'all hear me? Can everybody hear me? Good. If not, please chat us, let us know. Let us know with a thumbs up or reaction. And also let us know if you're able to access the caption option on Zoom. If you have any questions about accessibility during our program, please chat us, and the LCC staff, Lauren is here, will be able to guide you through the process. So the Climates of Inequality series is featuring 7 online presentations this fall, where guest speakers will be highlighting how frontline communities in the Chicago region who are impacted by environmental pollution and climate change, and more recently by COVID-19, are demanding justice and putting forward a vision to create healthier and safer communities. There are many reasons why people migrate, but environmental factors, including the degradation of local ecosystems and the aftermath of extreme weather events, are playing more and more a significant role in people's decision to leave their homes. The migrant exodus from Central America in the last couple of years, when people are fleeing gang violence, poverty, and political corruption, is intertwined with environmental instability, and that is being called climate violence, resulting from the combination of extreme climate conditions and social realities. Climate violence is an intensifier of injustice affecting the most vulnerable populations: Blacks, Indigenous, and the people of color, and in particular, the women, the very old and young, LGBTQIA+, and the disabled community. Today's presentation will offer an insight and the continuing intersection of structural environmental degradation by the dry corridor involving southern Mexico and Central American countries not compromised by the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we start the presentation, a few shout outs to our partners, the Humanities Action Lab. Thank you for hosting our Zoom webinar today, where the Climates of Inequality Traveling Exhibition Project resides, and organizations Alianza Americas and the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, or known as El Vejo, for collaborating with the LCC to create the local story, which is called Resisting Cycles of Environmental Injustice in La Villita, which you can check out in the LCC website. I believe there's a link that has been shared on the chat or will be shared soon. Also, special thanks to our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, the Department of Anthropology, the Las Ganas Program, the Latin American Latino Studies Program, Latin American Recruitment and Educational Services, known as LATIS, Museum and Exhibition Studies, the School of Arts and Art History, and we also have UIC student organizations. They are the Alpha Psi Samba Zeta Chapter, Hope for the Day, the Latinx Graduate Student Association, known as the LGSA, the Roosevelt Network, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Union for Puerto Rican Students. And special thanks to the student panelists that are in Dr. Rosa Cabrera's Environmental and Climate Justice class. They are Abby Foss, Cache Gibson, Jojo Galvan Mora, and Laura Sato. The presentation will be about 30 minutes long, followed by a short Q&A conversation between these students and the presenter. And now, thank you for bearing with me. I know that it's a long intro, but it's very important to give credit where it's due. This is a very exciting project. Now I'm very delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Oscar Chacón is a co-founder and executive director of Alianza Americas, a Chicago-based national network of Latin American immigrant-led and immigrant-serving organizations with a mission to improve the quality of life of Latin American immigrant communities in the US, as well as peoples throughout the Americas. Chacón is an immigrant from El Salvador and an organizer and leader on community justice struggles at the local, national, and international levels for more than 40 years. He has occupied leadership positions in multiple organizations, including various international solidarity networks in the 1980s, such as Centro Presente, Oxfam America, the Northern California Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights. Chacón is a frequent spokesperson domestically and internationally on economic, social, political, and cultural struggles involving Latin American communities, including the nexus between economic inequality, human mobility, and white supremacy. So welcome to our virtual community, Oscar. We are very excited to have you today for our Climates of Inequality virtual presentation. Thank you. Welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mario. I'm very honored with this invitation. I'm very happy to be with you all. And I will try to keep my clock going so that I honor the 30 minutes that you mentioned. I'm very happy that you decided to take into account a reality that seems to be far away, the reality of Mexico and Central American countries in the context of this particular series. The reality is that they're not really far away realities we should not be concerned about. These are realities that are very much part of the daily life across many communities throughout the US, to the extent that most of the Central American, Mexican nationals who have left their countries very often, and even without knowing, due partly to climate change reasons, end up in our communities. And to that extent, we should all be very concerned about these issues. I'm gonna try to share my screen now so that I can actually present a little bit or use partly a presentation I want to show. Let me actually go back to the beginning of this because I was not very organized. Here we go, let's see, and share this as well. Okay, I decided to take a look at the question of climate change from a long-term perspective because I believe that the history of countries in Central America, Mexico, has a lot of influence on where we are today. And it is important, therefore, to see at these issues from a historical point of view. Just a couple of words about Alianza Americas. We are a transnational network of community-based organizations who happen to be, by and large, Latin American immigrant-led organizations. And in as far as the overall purpose of our work, we do policy advocacy. We develop leadership, strengthen leadership within our network. We organize fact-finding delegations, as well as educational tours in the US. As you can imagine, I mean, COVID-19 has had a very significant impact, limiting us in as far as this particular line of work. And finally, we do a lot of what we call citizen diplomacy, which is basically just a way of getting communities across the nation and even beyond the US involved in policy advocacy processes. As I mentioned, we are a network nowadays, a bit more than 50 member organizations. We have also active partnerships with organizations in Mexico and Central American countries. And the overall binding criteria that tie us not only as a network, but also with our partners in Central America and in Mexico is the search for transnational justice as an overall criteria to, as I said, I mean, bind the work that we do. Now, before I actually talk specifically about the link between climate change and migration, I think it is important to understand that the challenges of climate change is not something that is happening in an isolated set of realities. I mean, it is actually happening in a reality that has been shaped by economic, political decisions that have been with us for quite a while. And I'm only listing some of them, although there are several others, I mean, that are important. But the first one that I want to bring up, which I believe is very, very important and has had major impact in the way, particularly, the environment has been damaged in Central America, is this idea that free market has the solution for everything, or what I call the hegemony of free market fundamentalism. And among the many ideas that this particular way of thinking, which is hegemonic, has impacted us, one is, the idea that growth is always good. And as we all know, growth means essentially more consumption. And more consumption is not necessarily something good from an environmental justice, from an environmental well-being point of view, but that is indeed at the core of this free market fundamentalism. Second of all, we have also been told over and over again that the public sector is inefficient, is expensive, is bad, and that the private sector, on the other hand, is efficient and reasonable. And this, again, is a very widespread, widely accepted idea, sometimes without even knowing. We find ourselves repeating some of these ideas. Lower taxes to the rich stimulate industry and create jobs. And don't worry, because the benefits will eventually reach everybody. That's a promise that we've been told not only in Central America and in Mexico, but over the last 40 years, it's also true very much in the US. And again, it's part of this context, that I want to make sure we understand. And the final issue is that to reduce environmental impact or social regulation is actually bad, because it will impede growth, it will impede the ability for societies to actually excel and prosper, which, as I said, is simply not true. We have also been living in a period where growing economic inequality has also been part of many of the countries involved in this particular region, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and the rest of the Central American countries. And I also want to point out that, interestingly, during these past 40 years, the notion that trade is good and that therefore goods and money should be free to move as much as one wishes has also become extremely popular. I often ask audiences listening to this idea to think for a minute about the clothing that they are wearing and to take a minute to actually look at the tag in the clothing and see where your clothing was manufactured. And you will see that by and large, not only clothing, but computer equipment, furniture, anything that you can imagine is essentially manufactured abroad. And this exemplifies what I'm saying. That basically capital and goods don't need visas. They move pretty freely, but not people. People cannot move freely. And one thing I have to say from the beginning is Trump has been extremely aggressive in trying to essentially eliminate the possibility or the ability, I should say, of people to move. But nothing has been more effective at really halting the movement of people as the pandemic reality that we are in now has been. For all practical purposes, the movement of people has come to a halt. And we'll see how long this lasts because of some of the situations that are still in place in Mexico and in Central America. And I'll mention more about this in a minute. But the worst part of all this context I'm laying out is that very often we end up demonizing, blaming immigrants for the negative fallout that comes primarily as a result of item number 2 and item number 3 that I just mentioned. And as you can probably agree with me, it is sadly the reality that in the world we live in today, refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers are often blamed as if they are the source of all of our problems. And in a country like the US, especially over the past 3.5 years, it's been very popular to say that immigrants are basically ruining our country, which is why we need to get rid of them. So again, all this is part of this narrative that tend to blame immigrants for problems that clearly immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers did not necessarily cause. More into the question of the last few years in as far as the movement of people in Central America, in Mexico, I have to say that what really made the news big time about 3.5, 4 years ago was the beginning of a new modality in the way people decided to leave their countries. In the past, and I mean up until about 5 years ago, people were essentially living on a one-by-one basis. It was more like a drop-by-drop kind of situation. But beginning about 5 years ago or so, we actually began to notice this major shift in the organizing of what they call caravans, which is basically lots of people trying to move together. And some people argue that the reason for this in part is because people assume that there is safety in numbers. Obviously, that's very much debatable because as I told you a minute ago, the movement of people has been, for all practical purposes, halted with or without caravans. And that's just a fact that I want to make sure that we understand. I also want to make sure that we understand that climate change in the ways it takes shape in Mexico and in Central American countries is not alone, the reason why people are indeed finding themselves forced, to move, forced to flee their homes, their towns, their countries. There are several other factors, that are also part of the equation. And in this respect, it is important to understand that climate change is simply a factor that has been there for many years. And it is in many ways a worsening factor when you look at the other factors that are also behind the movement of people, particularly from a corridor such as the one particularly made up by Southern Mexico and Central American countries. But I'm listing in this particular slide just some of the reasons. And I want to highlight that the socioeconomic inequalities that I listed first, as one of the key reasons why people are moving, Mario was actually kind of mentioning some of these in his introduction. The social impact that results from climate change making everything worse is not necessarily felt equally, by everybody. I can tell you for sure that in the case of Central American countries, as well as Southern Mexico, indigenous communities, Afro-Latinos, Afro-Central Americans, Afro-Mexicans tend to be very much part of the people who suffer the most. Women, most definitely, people that represent, the LGBTQ communities are also very much affected, by the combination of these factors, including, the environmental impact that is, again, combining to essentially drive people away from their countries. I also believe it is important to understand that aside from the factors I already listed, there are specific realities that are also pushing people out and that have a lot to do, with how climate change is making the realities of life far more difficult for millions of people in this particular region, known by many as the dry corridor, and I'll address this also in a minute. But I also want to point out that many Central Americans and Mexicans altogether, probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 17 million people have left these countries over the past past 30, 40 years. And to the extent that they have settled in a country like the US, the question of family reunification comes in. People want to be together. We love to live in family. And in this respect, family reunification becomes also an important factor that makes people leave, and not leave to go anywhere, leave to go to a place where they know somebody, where they have a relative. And I think it is important to highlight that particular aspect. Hunger and malnutrition is also one of the greatest impacts of climate change, to the extent that lands and soils are becoming arid. They are no longer what they used to be. People cannot grow corn, beans, and other basic necessities, basic grains that they used to grow to be able to take care of their basic needs. All this, of course, leads to just a sharpening of poverty in these countries. And then you can see, I mean, the rest of consequences that I'm listing in this particular graphic. And again, I want to emphasize who are the most affected populations when it comes to who sees themselves forced, to have to leave their countries. I was making reference to the so-called dry corridor. I mean, this map generated by different UN agencies has basically exemplified where is this so-called dry corridor concentrated. And as you can see, countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, almost all of it, a good portion of Honduras, Nicaragua, and even Costa Rica, all the way down to Panama, are specific locations in the corridor known as the dry corridor, where the life of people are being deeply changed, deeply affected, especially by climate change events. And keep in mind, I mean, this is only one of the expressions of climate change and its impact in these particular territories. We all probably have heard of also rain, which causes, especially when it falls in massive amounts in areas of soil that are essentially arid, they also become flooding. And flooding can also be a huge factor why people find themselves from one day to the other sometimes. And we have had recently lots of flooding happening both in Mexico as well as in Central American countries. They can see their life literally change from one day to the other. I mean, the entire livelihood of communities can change deeply by the combination of these events. Add to this something that is also very common, especially in this region, and it is earthquakes. Seismic movement is also part of the reality that tends to aggravate the other consequences of climate change, added to the socioeconomic, political conditions that I also mentioned at the beginning, all ultimately resulting in conditions that make the tendency towards even greater movements of people become sharper. I also want to highlight the fact that several of these countries that have seen so many of their nationals forced to leave, many of them have actually tried to come to the US, have tried to secure humanitarian protection in the US, because as I said, I mean, it's the country they know the most, it's the country where somebody they know already resides. And many of these people have actually tried to stay here by seeking humanitarian protection, particularly in the form of asylum. And again, I want to highlight one aspect of this entire debate, namely the nexus between climate change and the mobility of people, human mobility. And it is the fact that to this day, there is no such a thing as climate refugees, climate change refugees. That is not a legal definition that allows people who are forced to leave their countries and seek protection to argue that that is the reason why they need protection. And this is where the combination of factors that are behind what makes people make ultimately the decision to leave their countries becomes so important. Because in places like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, these are countries that have been on and off in the news over the past 10 years, Mexico as well, as very violent countries. Countries where the homicidal rate is through the roofs. And therefore, the presence of these realities combined with the presence of several other forms of violence, not all the violence that takes place is violence caused by criminal organizations. In some countries, official forces, governmental forces, are also responsible for abuse of power and result often in people finding themselves with no other option but to leave the countries they were born in and the countries they love. And in this respect, many people have actually tried to apply for asylum as a way of gaining protection in the US. But as is probably known to many of you, this particular administration, the Trump administration, has actually been very successful in essentially eliminating the possibility of people even reaching the US and applying for asylum. They have created mechanisms that essentially keep people away from the US border. Mexico, the government of Mexico has become a principal ally of the US in stopping people from even entering into Mexico, holding them down in the Mexico-Guatemala border. And Central American governments have been lately also openly making known to anybody that they will do anything they can to stop people from leaving. So the formula going forward, I mean, it's actually scary because nothing has fundamentally changed, not climate change either. And yet, people may find themselves not at all free anymore to exercise their right to leave, the country, to leave the place where they no longer feel safe. The Guatemala-Mexico border, as I already mentioned, has become a great point of contention. I have visited quite a number of times over the past few years, and it is impressive how the Mexican Guatemala government has become heavily militarized, the largest detention center for migrants, many of whom are direct migrants resulting, or refugees, if you want, resulting from climate change, are actually now placed in detention at a detention facility located in Tapachula, Mexico, in the state of Chiapas. And I also want to highlight the fact that the Mexico-US border is actually not in any way, shape, or form a border that is close, to most Central American countries. I listed here the average distance that Central Americans will have to go through if they attempt to actually cross their countries, cross Mexico, and attempt to get to the US. And as I said, and I want to emphasize, sadly, there is no mechanism that ensures the protection of these communities that are very much deserving of protection, but what they often find is rejection. Now, I also want to highlight the fact that if we want to speak about what has been the official response to these particular events in which, again, climate change is very much embedded, the way I summarize, I mean, the responses are basically in these boxes that I decided to highlight. As I mentioned earlier, people have come to accept the notion that immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers are basically something to fear, something that is bad for our country. This is what the xenophobia across the region refers to. And this is not only true in the US, it is also true in Mexico, and believe it or not, it's even true in some of the Central American countries. Asylum, which at some point had some promise of perhaps becoming a mechanism that could evolve into recognition of the fact that climate change is indeed forcing so many people to be displaced. What we have seen is actually increased restrictions in the ability for people to actually seek and secure humanitarian protection. I also want to highlight that the Trump administration in particular has actually used the threat of cutting back US aid. And I want to say very clearly, not all US foreign assistance is actually good. Very often US foreign assistance only makes the problem worse from every respect, from a social, economic, political, cultural, and of course, environmental perspective. But to the extent that there are some programs that are actually good, that are helping people seek alternatives by way of adaptation, for example, to the climate change threat in their countries, it is bad news, if those kind of support programs are actually eliminated because the US is threatening to do so. The asylum agreements, I already mentioned them. They are essentially designed to make it nearly impossible for people to seek and receive protection in the form of asylum. And there is now this program called Remaining Mexico, or MPP, Migrant Protection Program is the actual official title of the program, which prevents many people wishing to arrive in the US and petition for asylum, file for asylum, to be able to do so. Instead, they are kept very often in infrahuman conditions in Mexico, where ultimately the goal is to really find a way to send them back to the very realities that they left behind. Now, just to come close to the end of my presentation, I think it is important to understand that the challenges are humongous, and the way forward in terms of solutions are also not easy to bring about. The way to respond to this crisis, in my view, is to really make sure that we respond in a coordinated manner. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in the countries where these realities are being experienced. Sadly, we have increasingly a situation in Mexico and in Central American countries, but in spite of the fact that there is recognition that climate change is a gravely threatening crisis going forward, not enough investment is being made, not enough tax dollars are available to be able to support the type of activities that need to be undertaken to be prepared, to deal with the effects of climate change, to adapt the economic systems in these countries to this reality, and to also the possibility of getting countries like Central American nations, even Mexico, to really work together in an approach as a region vis-a-vis the US, to get the US lawmakers to understand that at least for the foreseeable future, it will be necessary to figure out how to best provide protection to what most experts agree will become only an even sharper crisis that will likely lead to the movement of far more people from Central American countries and Southern Mexico, largely resulting from the worsening effects of climate change, combined, of course, with the other structural realities that affect the life of people in Central American countries. I also believe it is important to learn to decode the way people who are on the move, people who are fleeing, talks about why they left. A lot of people are not really familiar, with the concept of climate change. I have to say, as somebody who's been trying to be more and more active in this particular field, this remained a field of work that both domestically and internationally is still very much dominated by, let's put it frankly, white advocates that very often do not understand the reality of communities that are coming from Central America and Mexico, Afro-Central Americans, indigenous, and the rest of the communities that are involved in these processes. And to this extent, it is not surprising that when you ask people, why did you leave your country? They will probably not mention climate change at all. And it is because they don't understand that climate change is embedded in what they actually saw as the reason. They will tell you that their crops dry because there was no rain. And when finally rain came down, it was so heavy that it flooded, their crops. And this may be more of a reason that people will tell you led them to move to an urban center, to realize that there were no opportunities at all in the urban center, and that the very last idea they came up with is that there was no other choice but to leave their countries. I also think it is important to take a harder look at how much we will need to do to actually change policies, both at the national level as well as the global level. Because as I mentioned before, only recently there have been some discussion at the UN level, for example, to really look into climate change as a driver of large movements of people. But we are far from actually finding a solution similar to the solution that was brought into place in the 1950s, when there were a lot of people moving from one place to the other, mainly in the context of the Cold War, the war between communism and the US, essentially. But nothing at that level is actually happening. And this is sad because climate change does not wait for anybody. It's moving forward, especially to the extent that we refuse to make the changes that we need to make in economic policy, in fiscal policy, in budgetary priorities, etc. And the final thing I want to say is that in spite of everything I just told you, the majority of people in Mexico, in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, they love their countries and they really wish they didn't have to leave. And the people who do leave, it's only because of the level of desperation that they reach in their lives. But as I said, I believe the obligation that we all have is to try to find ways of partnering with civil society, with governments, with multilateral institutions, and with communities to try to be able to find the set of measures that we all need to undertake together to make it possible for people who love their countries and who wish to stay in their countries to do so, but to do so in a way that is safe and that is dignified. I have spoken for 30 minutes and 17 seconds, so I'm ready to go away. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you so much, Oscar. And I'm very happy that Rosa was able to join us. So basically, we're going to open it up to student facilitators from Rosa's class. So I'll hand it over to Rosa so you can say a few words.
Yeah, hello, everybody. A late introduction. I am Rosa Cabrera, Director of the Latino Cultural Center. And thank you again for joining us in this beautiful sunny afternoon. So I think now, yeah, we're going to open it up for the panelists to ask questions to the presenter.
I think I'll start if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So I want to thank you for being here and for your time and for this wonderful presentation. Your first slide particularly got me really interested, and sort of looking at what you laid out in terms of what I saw as sort of like an allusion back to this concept of Reaganomics, of trickle-down economics. So my question is, do you think that the fight against climate change in Latin America is also a fight against neoliberal policy? Why or why not?
Well, let me be very specific. Not long ago, the middle of September, there were a number of news stories about a pretty famous Chicago-based economist, Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman is actually somebody, indeed, responsible for what we call neoliberal economic policies. But I would argue that Milton Friedman actually injected a particular approach to how capitalist systems should be run. And the evolution of that basic idea, which basically argued that the sole responsibility of capitalist systems is to make investors richer, period. The rest is secondary. That basic idea is what today remains the dominant approach. And I happen to believe that unless we make radical changes in the way we understand the basic logic of economic systems, economic policy, capitalism, the countries indeed, and not only the country, but the world is bound to experience even harsher weather events related to climate change, like those we have already eyewitnessed, not only in faraway lands, but here in the US. Look at the fires that have been ravaging California and a lot of the west coast of the US. I think are very much evidence that unless we are prepared to make a shift in as far as what do we consider the most important goal of economic activity, and frankly come to grips with the fact that unless we find a way to make everybody, private sector included, or I would even argue at the top of it, responsible to ensure that we place the well-being of individuals and the sustainability of the planet as central criteria to be able to come up with ways in which we can really promise that the children of today will actually have an opportunity for a life that is in some way more dignified than the one that we are having. We are doomed to fail. And so, yes, I believe that it is absolutely crucial to shift, the essential ideology that backs up, the economic policies that have been adopted and that we call either neoliberalism or Washington consensus or a structural economic adjustment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I can go next. One thing that we have talked about in our class, and I was interested in asking you, in your opinion, is you mentioned and we mentioned in class that there is no definition for a climate change refugee. And there's also, we talked about the worry of people taking advantage of the fact that it's a little more ambiguous, of the fact that, as you mentioned earlier in your presentation, that in many ways it's an exacerbator of factors. And also that many of the people that are seeking refugee sometimes they don't mention climate change as an issue. And so how would you suggest we basically deal with that? How can we make sure that climate change refugee is something that is considered serious and also defined in a way that doesn't allow people to push it off as less serious?
It's an excellent question, and there is no easy answer because let's begin by just amplifying something I briefly mentioned. When you look at who are the organizations in the US and around the world that are getting the largest grants or the largest governmental support to tackle climate change from the bottom up, they are not organizations led by Black people. They are not organizations led by indigenous communities. They are not organizations led by working women, across the board. And that is a reality that, in my view, is connected, to one of the problems that has become more evident in the past few months in the US, and it is the problem with the way white supremacy tends to permeate, everything that we do in ways in which we are not even aware, we are not even conscious of it. I can tell you that in Central American countries, in Mexico, most peasants that are really finding their way of life profoundly transformed because of climate change events and the accumulated effect of decades, of climate worsening conditions, they never heard, of climate change. Nobody ever took time, to really make them part of the conversation. And again, in my view, this is related to this layer that is rather subtle that we don't talk about because we approach the conversation from what I call basically a deficitary point of view, a deficit-minded way of approaching the problem. Many of my friends tell me, well, we should be grateful that at least somebody is investing in matters of climate change. It doesn't matter who's receiving the support. And I believe it does make a difference. And so in my view, partly what we need to challenge more and more, especially young folks like you who tomorrow may be in positions to influence the way resources flow, to make sure that we actually take into account the opinions and the engagement and the expertise of people who are actually enduring the worst consequences of the many, many decades, if not centuries, of neglect. I also want to take advantage of your question to point out that not far from today, I was very involved in a UN-led effort to engage countries around the world in what came to be known as the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. Interestingly, the issue of climate change came up in both contexts, in the conversation about migrants and the conversation about refugees. But as it is sadly the case, just as we were beginning to approach that conversation, the politicization of the large movement of people became so controlled by extremist-minded political forces that sadly arrived into government, not only in the US, but in several other countries around the world. It became impossible to actually have a rational conversation about these issues, not only in terms of how can we best provide humanitarian protection to them, but what can we do to really begin to tackle this issue from its root, related precisely to how communities that are enduring the effects of climate change should be indeed leaders, not just participants, but leaders in the conversation about what are we to do about all this. So I hope to have more or less answered your question.
Thank you.
I know you were mentioning the driving factors of why people emigrate to different places. And that led me to, I just wanted to know, what does it really mean for a country to be considered violent? This is something that I hear all the time. And just what does that mean? Because, you know, Chicago's considered violent and people move away from there, but that's not the same thing.
Yes. Well, you know, I want to pick up on something Mario said in the introduction. Mario said, I think that the words that he used was the violence of climate change. I may be misquoting you, Mario, but that's more or less the idea that I picked up. And I was immediately reminded that when it comes to violence, you know, we tend to have a view about violence that is very much shaped by the way in which violence is portrayed, you know, in mass culture. The reality is that the kind of violence that is most destructive in the long haul is not even the violence that comes as a result of people using firearms, you know, but the violence that results from not investing in education, the violence that results from not investing in healthcare, the violence that results in not investing in decent housing for everybody, the violence that results by keeping labor laws so incredibly oppressive that even minimum wage salaries are laughable because they don't amount to enough for people to live a way of life that has dignity. So that kind of violence is very much present. And I would argue that is a kind of violence that we don't even talk about in the US. You know, you are correct. I mean, people talk about violent places and they immediately think of Chicago or New York or East LA. But the reality is the violence that is being exercised by the way in which people are being denied the opportunity for a decent, secure way of life for them and their children is another form of violence that we don't talk about. And in this respect, Central American countries have forever endured this kind of a structural systemic violence that I'm referring to, but they are also enduring violence that is the result of US policies. For example, many of you may have heard about gangs, you know, violent gangs in Honduras, El Salvador, and even in Mexico, and maybe even thinking that these are expressions of violence that are very much from those countries. The sad reality is that gang violence is very much the result of mistaken policies by the US, which essentially deported violent gang members from Los Angeles. And, you know, I can give you a full explanation as to why those people became involved in violent gangs in Los Angeles. They were deported to Honduras, to El Salvador, to Guatemala, to Mexico, where there was nothing in place for these people to really find ways of incorporating in a different manner than the lifestyle they have become part of in the US. And within a matter of 1.5 decades, this becomes a serious problem that drives a lot of people away from these countries. But in addition to that, you also have serious problems with power abuse. And the power abuse is very often carried out by military forces, by police forces that have a sad history when it comes to respecting human rights. And they, at the least provocation, go and unleash, their force not only against people in general, but specifically against political opponents, people that they perceive are becoming too strong voices in criticizing the government. They find a way also to go after them. So as you can see, the violence that drives people away, it's widespread and multifaceted. The most simple way in which violence is measured, and the UN has a standard for this, is homicidal rate. But homicidal rate is like the worst that you can possibly find, but it is not the sole way of measuring how violent a country happens to be. So in my view, most of these countries that we are talking about, the so-called dry corridor involving especially Southern Mexico and Central American countries, they are very much exposed to systemic, profound, super violent realities that precisely end up driving them away from their countries and in search of safe haven in a country like the US, without finding it, by the way.
All right, so you mentioned transnational advocacy throughout your presentation, and you mentioned the UN was talking about it, but then it became a very politicized issue. So what are ways in which we can kind of create a kind of dialogue that would not, because climate change and climate refugee, those are very political words. Those will get a very knee-jerk reaction from certain people about how they feel. So how can we go about kind of creating these advocacy networks that can be cross-border? Because the US doesn't exactly have a good track record with advocacy across the border. So what ways do you think that we can actively pursue these advocacy networks while also ensuring that we're not forgetting other people are affected by this more than we are?
Well, you are absolutely correct. I mean, that sadly, the way in which we have devolved over the past 10, 15 years has taken us to where we are today, a place in which even the vast number of scientific studies that clearly point to the reality of climate change is still being denied. There are people in powerful positions around the world, especially here in the US, that would argue that climate change is indeed a hoax. I mean, that this is simply an invention that does not have any truth behind it. And again, I mean, I think that we are just around the corner from a day in the US where elections are taking place, where we have an opportunity, everybody who is a US citizen and who is in age of voting should be doing so. And I believe that if we are indeed to show commitment to beginning to tackle the complexities of climate change and its impact, we need to begin by asserting affirmatively and unequivocally that science does matter. And if there are people running for office that are telling us that this is all a hoax, I mean, we should be able to actually, at least by casting a ballot in a given way, make a counter statement about that. But that's, in many ways, in some ways simplistic. I mean, I think that the depth of the problem is of such a magnitude that we need to also understand that a lot of conversations need to be taking place in every place that we can possibly find a public to hold them. I mean, whether that is public libraries, churches, civil society organizations. I think that we all need to find a way of engaging in this conversation. I told you at the beginning of my presentation that one of the things that we have done over the past 10, 15 years is actually take people who are playing leadership roles in the US, whether that is state legislators or leaders of important civic organizations locally in a place like Chicago or someplace else in the country. We organize them to come and actually get to know countries like Mexico, like El Salvador, and not touristically speaking, but to get to know the realities of common people's lives so that they can begin to understand, number one, how profoundly linked we are with those realities. And upon their return, become part of the conversations that need to be happening every place that we can to begin to get us educated about the fact that when it comes to a matter like climate change, it is impossible to assume that we can solve this challenge by assuming that I can take care of it in the US. It needs to be a global, transnational conversation. And I believe that we are only in the very earliest stages of developing the kind of partnerships that we need, partnerships across multiple sectors, to begin to actually have the conversations, understand each other's point of view, and agree on some basic principles that would allow us to begin to move forward. And again, I go back to something I said. I believe evidence and science have to be at the center of the conversation. Otherwise, we run the risk of also becoming part of the problem.
I think we have come to an end now. It's 5:30. So thank you, Oscar, for speaking to us about the ecological and human situation in the dry corridor and how the social realities are limiting any significant climate adaptation, right? Leaving people with no other choice than to flee their homes. That's the reality. And thank you to the students, panelists, and LCC staff. And thank you all for listening and for sharing a space today and intention to build and sustain a collective solidarity that is going to be needed to resolve our climate crisis. And I just, want to point out very quickly that, while people think that continue to think that climate change is a hoax, or at least you're hearing more lately that it's not that it's a hoax, but they don't think the humans is causing it, right? So they're changing the tune. I think, that what we're seeing is this massive adjustment that the United States making in climate adaptation program that is really for the rich and the powerful. That's what it is all about, right? We're seeing more and more militarization. We're seeing a lot of more people investing in tools and surveillance, right? To respond to climate change as people are leaving their homes and closing borders. So it's something that, it's a disastrous thing to think about it, but it is actually happening and it's growing. So we all have to be very attentive to what is going on. And, I hope that everybody that is with us here today can join us in our next Climates of Inequality presentation. The next one is scheduled for Wednesday, October 28th, same time. Our guest speaker will be Amalia Nieto Gomez with Alianza of the Southeast and Olga Bautista with Alianza for the Great Lakes. And you can register for the next program in the LCC website, where you can also find the recording of all the presentations that we have done so far. So again, thank you to everyone, and try to enjoy the rest of the still sunny day. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Pleasure.